The morning started like any other Tuesday, but by noon Lisa's world had completely fallen apart. She stood frozen in front of her apartment door, staring at the bright orange notice that seemed to mock her with its official stamped letters. Final eviction notice, 72 hours to vacate. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. "Mommy, what's that paper?" 7-year-old Sophie's voice cut through the panic that was building in Lisa's chest. Her daughter's small hand tugged at her worn jeans. The same pair she'd been wearing for 3 days straight because laundry had become a luxury she couldn't afford. "It's nothing. Sweetheart?" Lisa managed to say, quickly pulling the notice down and crumpling it in her hands. But Sophie wasn't easily fooled. At 7, she'd already learned to read the worry lines on her mother's face, the way her shoulders slumped when bills arrived, and the forced brightness in her voice when she said everything was going to be okay. Inside their tiny one-bedroom apartment, Lisa sank onto the threadbare couch that doubled as her bed each night. Sophie got the bedroom, that was non-negotiable. No matter how bad things got, her daughter would have her own space, her own little sanctuary with the butterfly stickers on the wall that they'd put up together during happier times. 3 days. That's all she had left. Lisa's mind raced through the possibilities, but each door she imagined knocking on seemed to slam shut before she could even reach it. Her sister lived across the country and was struggling with her own family's financial problems. Her parents had passed away in a car accident 2 years ago, just 6 months after her husband Mike had lost his battle with cancer. The few friends she'd had before Mike got sick had slowly drifted away during those long months of hospital visits and medical bills that kept piling up like autumn leaves. She'd tried everything. After Mike died, she'd used up their small savings account within 4 months. She'd sold his tools, his baseball card collection, even her wedding ring. Everything except the few photos and the small wooden box where he'd kept important papers and business cards. The temporary jobs she'd managed to find barely covered groceries, let alone rent. The last one at the grocery store had ended 3 weeks ago when they'd cut her hours down to nothing. Sophie was coloring at the small kitchen table, humming softly to herself. She had no idea that in 3 days they might be sleeping in their old Honda Civic, if it even started. The car had been making strange noises lately, and Lisa knew she couldn't afford to fix whatever was wrong with it. "Mommy, are you sad?" Sophie looked up from her coloring book, her big brown eyes, so much like Mike's, filled with concern that no child should have to carry. "Just thinking, baby. Keep coloring. That butterfly is beautiful." Lisa forced a smile and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the busy street below. People hurried past with purpose, carrying briefcases and coffee cups, heading to jobs and meetings and normal lives that felt like a distant memory. She opened the small wooden box on the counter, Mike's box. Inside were a few important documents, some old receipts, and a collection of business cards from doctors, insurance agents, and people who had tried to help during Mike's illness. Her fingers shuffled through them absently until one caught her attention, a simple white card with elegant black lettering. Robert Chen, Community Assistance Coordinator. Lisa's heart skipped. She remembered this card. Mike had mentioned Robert once, maybe twice, during his treatment. Something about a man who helped families when medical bills became overwhelming. Mike had been too proud to ask for help back then, always saying they could handle it themselves, that they didn't need charity. But Mike wasn't here now, and pride was a luxury Lisa couldn't afford when her daughter's future was hanging in the balance. She turned the card over in her hands. There was no phone number, just a name and what looked like it might be a title. But Mike had kept it for a reason. Maybe, just maybe, this Robert Chen was still helping people. Maybe he'd remember Mike, remember their story. That evening, after Sophie had fallen asleep clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit, Lisa sat at the kitchen table with a pad of paper and a pen that was running out of ink. She'd never been good with words. That had been Mike's gift. He could talk to anyone, make friends in grocery store lines, convince skeptical nurses to bend visiting hour rules with nothing but his warm smile and genuine concern for others. But this letter had to come from her heart, and her heart was breaking. "Dear Mr. Chen," she began, then stopped. "How do you ask a stranger to save your life? How do you put desperation into words without sounding like you're begging?" She started again. "Dear Mr. Chen, I don't know if you remember my husband, Mike Torres. You gave him your card about 8 months ago when he was going through cancer treatment at City General Hospital. The words came slowly at first, then faster as the story poured out. She told him about Mike's fight, about the bills that kept coming even after Mike was gone, about losing her job and trying to keep Sophie's world as normal as possible. She wrote about the eviction notice, about having nowhere to turn, about being scared that her daughter would end up homeless because she couldn't figure out how to fix their broken life. I know you probably get letters like this all the time, she wrote near the end, her hand cramping from gripping the pen so tightly, and I know Mike would be embarrassed that I'm reaching out like this. He always wanted to handle everything himself. But I'm not as strong as he was, and I don't know what else to do. Sophie deserves better than this, and I'm failing her every day. She signed it simply, Lisa Torres and Sophie. The next morning, Lisa walked to the public library and used their computer to search for Robert Chen's address. She found several listings, but one seemed right. R. Chen on Maple Street, just a few miles across town. It had to be him. She copied the address carefully onto an envelope, used one of her last stamps, and walked to the post office. Standing in front of the blue mailbox, Lisa hesitated for a moment. This felt like her last chance, her final lifeline before everything fell apart completely. She closed her eyes, thought about Mike, about Sophie's laugh, about the butterfly stickers on the bedroom wall. She dropped the letter into the slot and walked home, not knowing that her carefully copied address had one small, crucial mistake. Instead of 847 Maple Street, she'd written 874 Maple Street. Instead of reaching Robert Chen, the community volunteer who had helped so many families like hers, her desperate plea was heading straight to the home of Robert Chen, the millionaire tech entrepreneur who lived in the biggest house on the most expensive street in the city. Robert Chen pulled into his circular driveway after a 3-day business trip to Seattle, his black Tesla making barely a whisper as it came to a stop. The massive stone house before him looked exactly as he'd left it. Perfectly manicured lawns, pristine flower beds, and windows that gleamed in the afternoon sun. But somehow, after spending days in cramped conference rooms and sterile hotel suites, coming home to all this luxury felt strangely empty. He grabbed his leather briefcase and headed to the front door, nodding to his housekeeper Maria, who was watering the plants on the front porch. "Welcome back, Mr. Chen," she said with a warm smile. "I put your mail on the kitchen counter. Nothing urgent, just the usual business correspondence." Robert loosened his tie as he walked through the marble entryway. At 42, he'd built his tech company from nothing more than an idea and a maxed-out credit card in his college dorm room. 15 years later, he employed over 500 people and lived in a house that most people only saw in magazines. Success had come faster than he'd ever imagined, but lately, he'd been wondering what it all meant. In the kitchen, he poured himself a glass of water and glanced at the neat stack of mail Maria had organized for him. Bills for services he barely used, invitations to charity galas where people wrote checks to feel better about themselves, investment reports showing numbers that had long since stopped meaning anything real to him. He almost missed it completely. A simple white envelope buried beneath a glossy magazine, his name and address written in shaky handwriting that looked nothing like the computer-printed labels he was used to seeing. Robert picked up the envelope and studied it. The paper was thin, the kind you'd buy at a dollar store, and whoever had written his address had pressed so hard with their pen that the letters had almost torn through. There was something desperate about the way his name was written, like the person had been holding their breath while forming each letter. He opened it carefully and unfolded a single sheet of notebook paper. The moment he started reading, he knew something was wrong. "Dear Mr. Chen, I don't know if you remember my husband, Mike Torres. You gave him your card about 8 months ago when he was going through cancer treatment at City General Hospital." Robert stopped reading and frowned. He'd never been to City General Hospital. He'd never met anyone named Mike Torres. His company donated money to various medical facilities, but he rarely visited them personally. He kept reading, growing more confused with each line. The letter told a story that broke his heart. A young mother named Lisa, struggling alone after her husband's death from cancer. A 7-year-old daughter named Sophie, who didn't understand why they had to move. Medical bills that had destroyed their savings, job loss, eviction notice, the kind of desperate situation that kept people awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering how everything had gone so wrong so fast. "I know you probably get letters like this all the time," Lisa had written, And I know Mike would be embarrassed that I'm reaching out like this. He always wanted to handle everything himself. But I'm not as strong as he was, and I don't know what else to do. Sophie deserves better than this, and I'm failing her every day. Robert read the letter 3 times, each reading making him feel more unsettled. This wasn't a form letter asking for money. This was a real person's life falling apart, written in the kind of raw honesty that you only see when someone has absolutely nothing left to lose. But it wasn't meant for him. He walked to his home office and sat behind the massive desk where he made decisions involving millions of dollars every day. But this simple handwritten letter had shaken him more than any business crisis ever had. He pulled out his laptop and started searching. Robert Chen Community Assistance brought up several results. There was Robert Chen the accountant, Robert Chen the teacher, and then he found him. Robert Chen, who had worked as a volunteer coordinator at City General Hospital until his death 6 months ago from a heart attack. The obituary mentioned his work helping families cope with medical expenses and his dedication to making sure no one faced their darkest hours alone. Robert leaned back in his chair as the pieces fell into place. This Lisa Torres had meant to write to a man who was already dead, a man who had apparently touched her family during their worst moments. Instead, her letter had found its way to him, a millionaire who lived behind gates and rarely thought about the struggles of ordinary people. He should have thrown the letter away. Or maybe forwarded it to someone else, some agency that dealt with these situations. That would have been the logical thing to do. But something about Lisa's words wouldn't let him forget. Maybe it was the way she'd mentioned her daughter Sophie, or how she'd admitted to not being as strong as her husband. Maybe it was because he'd grown up poor himself, before the success and the money had built walls around his life. Robert's phone rang, his assistant calling about tomorrow's board meeting. He let it go to voicemail. Instead, he found himself reading the letter again, imagining the woman who'd written it. She'd probably sat at a kitchen table late at night, maybe after her daughter was asleep, trying to find the right words to save their lives. She'd trusted a stranger with her deepest fears, not knowing that stranger was already gone. The next morning, Robert canceled his first 2 meetings and drove across town to an address he'd never visited before. The neighborhood was nothing like his own. Small houses with chain-link fences, cars that had seen better days, and children playing in streets where the asphalt had more cracks than smooth spots. He found the house easily enough, a modest ranch-style home with a for rent sign in the front yard. The new tenant was a young man named Kevin who'd moved in just last month. Yes, he'd heard about the previous tenant from neighbors. Robert Chen had lived there for almost 10 years, always helping people in the community. Kevin had found some of his mail still being delivered and had been returning it to the post office. Seemed like a really good guy, Kevin said, standing in the doorway. My neighbor Mrs. Patterson said he once paid her grandson's school lunch fees for a whole year. Never wanted any credit for it. Always said helping people was just what you did, you know. Robert thanked Kevin and walked back to his car, but he didn't start it right away. He sat there thinking about 2 Robert Chens, one who had spent his life accumulating wealth and another who had spent his life giving it away. One who lived in a mansion, and another who had lived in a modest home but had probably touched more lives in a week than Robert had in years. That evening, Robert sat in his enormous living room, Lisa's letter spread out on the coffee table in front of him. The house felt even bigger than usual, even more empty. He thought about Sophie, the 7-year-old girl who was probably scared and confused, not understanding why her world was falling apart. He thought about Lisa, trying to be brave for her daughter while everything crumbled around them. He could write a check. That would be easy enough. Send some money, solve the immediate problem, and go back to his regular life. But something told him this situation needed more than money. It needed the kind of personal attention that the other Robert Chen would have given. Robert picked up his phone and started making calls. First to his private investigator, asking him to find Lisa Torres and her daughter, not to spy on them, but to verify their situation and find out exactly what they needed. Then to his lawyer, asking about the legal way to help someone in financial crisis without creating complications. By midnight, Robert had a plan. He would go to Lisa Torres himself, not as Robert Chen the millionaire, but as someone who had received her letter and wanted to help. He would tell her about the mix-up, about the other Robert Chen who had clearly meant so much to her family. And then he would do what that other Robert Chen couldn't do anymore. He would make sure Lisa and Sophie had a chance at a better life. For the first time in months, maybe years, Robert felt like he had a purpose beyond making his next million. Lisa had been packing for 2 hours, but the 3 cardboard boxes sitting on her living room floor looked pathetically small. 7 years of life in this apartment, and everything they owned could fit into boxes she'd gotten from behind the grocery store. Sophie sat on the floor nearby, carefully placing her crayons one by one into a shoebox, as if taking extra care with them would somehow make everything okay. "Mommy, where are we going to live?" Sophie asked for the 5th time that morning. Her voice was small, confused, and it broke Lisa's heart every time she heard it. "I'm still figuring it out." "Sweetheart," Lisa said, folding one of Sophie's school dresses and placing it gently in the box. She'd been telling herself the same thing for 3 days now, but time was running out. Tomorrow morning, the landlord would be here with a sheriff's deputy, and they'd have to be gone. The letter to Robert Chen had been her last hope, and she hadn't heard anything back. Not a phone call, not even a letter saying he couldn't help. Just silence. She'd checked the mailbox twice yesterday, walking down to the cluster of metal boxes by the parking lot, and standing there longer than necessary, as if a response might magically appear if she waited long enough. Lisa was taping up a box when the knock came. 3 soft raps on the door, polite and hesitant. Her heart jumped. Maybe it was Mrs. Rodriguez from next door coming to say goodbye. Or maybe it was the landlord, here early to make sure they were really leaving. She walked to the door and looked through the small peephole. A man stood in the hallway, someone she'd never seen before. He was well dressed in a navy blue sweater and dark jeans, holding what looked like a piece of paper in his hand. He didn't look like a sheriff's deputy or a bill collector. He looked nervous. Lisa opened the door but kept the chain latch attached, creating just a small gap. "Can I help you?" The man cleared his throat. "Are you Lisa Torres?" Her stomach dropped. Nobody knew her name unless they were here about money she owed or problems she couldn't solve. "Yes, that's me. I'm Robert Chen," he said, holding up the piece of paper. Lisa could see now that it was her letter, the one she'd written 3 nights ago. "I think this was meant for someone else, but may I come in? I'd like to talk to you about it." Lisa stared at him through the gap in the door. This couldn't be right. Robert Chen was supposed to be the man who'd helped her husband, someone who worked with families at the hospital. This man looked like he belonged in a magazine, not in her rundown apartment building. His car, visible through the hallway window, was sleek and expensive. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know this is confusing," Robert said gently, "but I received your letter and I think there's been a mix-up. Could I explain? I promise I'm not here to cause any trouble." Sophie appeared beside Lisa, peeking around her mother's legs to look at the stranger. "Who is that, Mommy?" Robert's expression softened when he saw Sophie. Lisa noticed how his whole face changed, becoming warmer somehow. "Hi there," he said to Sophie. "You must be Sophie. I'm Robert. Are you here to help us move?" Sophie asked with the innocent directness that only children possess. Robert looked back at Lisa, and she saw something in his eyes that made her decision for her. Not pity exactly, but genuine concern, the kind of look her husband used to get when he met someone who needed help. Lisa unlatched the chain and opened the door wider. "Please come in. I'm sorry about the mess. We're packing." Robert stepped into the small apartment and Lisa immediately felt self-conscious about everything. The second-hand furniture, the boxes everywhere, the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter that she quickly moved out of sight. But Robert didn't seem to notice any of that. His attention was focused entirely on her and Sophie. "Can I offer you some water?" Lisa asked, falling back on the manners her mother had taught her. "I don't have much else right now." "Water would be nice, thank you." Lisa went to the kitchen, grateful for a moment to collect herself. Her hands shook slightly as she filled a glass from the tap. Through the opening between the kitchen and living room, she could see Robert talking quietly with Sophie, asking her about the drawing she'd been coloring. "That's a beautiful butterfly," she heard him say. "Did you draw that yourself?" "Uh-huh. Mommy says butterflies are special because they get to fly wherever they want. I wish I could be a butterfly." Lisa closed her eyes for a moment, fighting back tears. Even Sophie knew they were trapped. She returned to the living room with the water and sat down on the couch across from Robert, who had settled into the old armchair that had been Mike's favorite spot. Sophie climbed up next to her mother, still curious about their visitor. Robert took a sip of water, then looked directly at Lisa. "I need to explain about your letter," he said. "The Robert Chen you were trying to reach. He passed away 6 months ago." Lisa felt the world tilt. "What?" "He was a volunteer at City General Hospital. He helped families like yours deal with medical expenses in difficult situations. From what I've learned about him, he was an extraordinary man who touched a lot of lives." But you're Robert Chen." Lisa's voice was barely a whisper. "I am, but I'm a different Robert Chen. Your letter came to my house by mistake. You mixed up the address numbers. I never met your husband. I never worked at the hospital. I run a technology company." Lisa stared at him, processing this information. Her last hope, her final lifeline, had been based on a mistake. The man who might have helped them was dead, and this stranger had received her desperate plea by pure chance. "I'm so sorry," she said, tears starting to flow. "I didn't mean to bother you. I hoped—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Sophie looked confused, glancing between her mother and Robert. "Mommy, why are you crying?" Robert set down his water glass and leaned forward. "Lisa, you didn't bother me, and I didn't come here to tell you about the mistake and leave. I came here because your letter moved me more than anything I've read in years. I don't understand. When I read about what you and Sophie have been going through, about losing Mike, about the medical bills and the eviction, I couldn't just throw the letter away and pretend I never saw it. The Robert Chen you were looking for isn't here to help you anymore, but I am." Lisa shook her head. "I can't accept charity from a stranger. That's not— Mike would never— This isn't charity," Robert said firmly. "And I'm not really a stranger anymore, am I? You shared your story with me. You trusted me with your fears about Sophie, about failing as a mother, about not being as strong as Mike. That kind of trust means something." Sophie was watching the conversation like a tennis match, her head turning back and forth between the adults. "Are you going to help us not move?" she asked Robert. Robert looked at Sophie, then back at Lisa. "I'd like to try if your mom will let me." Lisa felt overwhelmed. This was all happening too fast. 3 days ago, she'd been facing eviction with no hope in sight. Now a stranger was sitting in her living room, offering help she didn't understand, connected to her only by a letter that had gone to the wrong address. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you want to help us?" "You don't know us." Robert was quiet for a moment, looking around the small apartment. Lisa could see him taking in the details. Sophie's drawings taped to the refrigerator, the photo of Mike on the end table, the careful way everything was organized despite their obvious financial struggles. "Because," he said slowly, "I think maybe your letter found exactly who it was supposed to find." Lisa stared at Robert for a long moment, trying to process what he'd just said. "I don't understand what you mean." Sophie had grown restless during the adult conversation and wandered back to her coloring book on the floor. She was humming softly while adding purple to a butterfly's wings, seemingly unaware that her entire future might be changing in this very moment. Robert shifted in the armchair, leaning forward slightly. "Can you tell me about Mike? About what kind of man he was?" The question caught Lisa off guard. She'd expected him to ask about their debts, about how much money they needed, about practical things. Instead, he wanted to know about her husband. She glanced at the photo on the end table, Mike holding baby Sophie at the hospital, both of them exhausted but glowing with happiness. Mike was— She started, then stopped. How do you sum up a person's entire character in a few sentences? He was the kind of person who noticed when someone was struggling. When he was going through treatment, even on his worst days, he'd check on other patients in the waiting room. He'd bring extra magazines from home, or he'd just sit and talk with people who looked scared or alone. Robert nodded, encouraging her to continue. "There was this one time," Lisa said, her voice growing stronger as the memory took hold. "We were at the hospital for one of his chemo sessions. There was a young mother there with her little boy, maybe 4 years old. The kid was terrified, crying every time they tried to take his blood. Mike sat down next to them and started telling this ridiculous story about brave knights who had to give magic drops from their arms to defeat dragons." Sophie looked up from her coloring. "Daddy told me that story too." "He did," Lisa said, smiling at her daughter. "By the end of Mike's story, this little boy was practically volunteering to have his blood drawn. The mother was crying, but happy tears, you know. She said her son had been having nightmares about the hospital visits, but after talking to Mike, He called himself a dragon fighter. Robert was listening intently, and Lisa found herself continuing. That's just who Mike was. He saw people's pain and he wanted to fix it, even when he was the one who needed help. Her voice caught slightly. Toward the end, when he knew he wasn't going to beat the cancer, he made me promise something. What was that? Lisa got up and walked to the kitchen, returning with a small notebook that had been tucked behind the toaster. He kept a list, she said, opening it to show Robert pages covered in Mike's careful handwriting. Names and addresses of people we'd met at the hospital, families who were struggling like we were. He wanted to help them somehow someday when we got back on our feet. Robert took the notebook and flipped through it carefully. There were dozens of entries. Names, brief notes about each family's situation, small sketches that Mike had apparently drawn while waiting in doctors' offices. One page showed a detailed plan for some kind of support network, with arrows connecting different families who might be able to help each other. He had big dreams, Lisa said quietly. He wanted to start something. Not a charity exactly, but a way for people who understood medical crises to help others going through the same thing. People who had been there, who knew what it felt like to choose between groceries and prescription medicine. This is incredible, Robert said, still studying the notebook. These notes, these connections he was making. He was building a community. Lisa sat back down, tucking her legs under her. Mike always said that money wasn't the only thing people needed when they were scared and sick. Sometimes they just needed someone to listen, someone to tell them they weren't alone. He thought people who had survived medical crises would be the best at helping others who were just starting that journey. And what about you? Robert asked. What did you do before all this happened? Lisa felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. I'm not as impressive as Mike was. I did graphic design, mostly freelance work, small businesses, local events, that kind of thing. Nothing big or important. Show me, Robert said simply. What? Show me your work. Do you have samples? Lisa hesitated. She hadn't touched her design software in months. Couldn't afford to maintain her subscriptions to the program she needed. Couldn't justify spending money on portfolio updates when they were behind on rent. But she still had some old projects saved on her laptop. She retrieved the laptop from the bedroom, Sophie trailing behind her out of curiosity. The machine was old and slow, but it still worked. Lisa opened a folder and turned the screen toward Robert. These are from before, she said apologetically. Before Mike got sick and everything changed. Robert studied the screen carefully. Lisa had designed logos for local restaurants, flyers for community events, even a small website for a neighborhood business. The work was clean, creative, and professional. Lisa, this is really good, he said, and she could tell he meant it. These designs are exactly what small businesses need. You have a real talent for making information clear and attractive. Thank you, but it doesn't matter much now. I can't afford the software anymore, and I haven't had time to look for clients. What if you didn't have to look for clients? What if clients came to you? Lisa frowned. I don't understand. Robert closed the laptop and set it aside. I run a technology company, but I work with dozens of small businesses, nonprofits, community organizations. They're always looking for good graphic designers, especially ones who understand what it's like to be on a tight budget. Are you offering me a job? I'm thinking about it. But more than that, I'm thinking about Mike's dream. Robert picked up the notebook again. What if we could actually do this? What if we could create the support network he envisioned? Sophie had been coloring quietly during the conversation, but she looked up now. Are you going to help people like Daddy wanted to? Robert looked at Sophie, then back at Lisa. What would you think about that? About turning Mike's idea into something real? Lisa felt overwhelmed again, but this time it was different. Instead of the crushing weight of problems she couldn't solve, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Possibility. I wouldn't know where to start, she said honestly. We'd figure it out together. You understand what families go through during medical crises because you lived it. I have resources and business connections, and we have Mike's notes, his vision of how it could work. But why? Lisa asked. The question that had been nagging at her since Robert had walked through her door. Why would you want to do this? You have your own company, your own life. Why would you care about Mike's dream? Robert was quiet for a moment, looking around the small apartment again. His eyes landed on Sophie's drawings on the refrigerator, then on the photo of Mike, then back to Lisa. Because, he said finally, I've spent the last 10 years building a successful business and accumulating wealth. but I can't remember the last time I felt like I was doing something that really mattered. Reading your letter, meeting you and Sophie, seeing Mike's notebook. This feels like something that matters. You don't even know us, but I want to. And I think Mike would have wanted his dream to live on, even if he couldn't be here to make it happen himself. Sophie had finished her butterfly and brought it over to show Robert. Look, I made the wings extra pretty. It's beautiful, Robert said, accepting the drawing. Just like your daddy's dream, it deserves to have wings and fly. Lisa wiped tears from her eyes as she watched this stranger, who was becoming less of a stranger by the minute, admire her daughter's artwork. Maybe Robert was right. Maybe her desperate letter had found exactly who it was supposed to find. 6 months later, Lisa stood in front of the large window in her new office, watching Sophie play in the small garden outside. The little girl was chasing butterflies between the flower beds, her laughter floating through the glass. It felt like a lifetime ago that they'd been packing boxes in that tiny apartment, facing eviction with nowhere to go. The office itself was nothing fancy, a converted house in a quiet neighborhood, with rooms that had been turned into workspaces and meeting areas. But it was theirs, or at least it belonged to the organization they'd built together. Above the front door, a simple wooden sign read Mike's Bridge with a small butterfly painted beside the letters. Sophie had insisted on the butterfly. The quarterly reports are ready for your review, came a voice from behind her. Lisa turned to see Robert walking in with a folder under his arm and 2 cups of coffee in his hands. Over the past months, this had become their routine. Morning coffee while they went over the details of families they were helping and projects they were planning. How many families are we working with now? Lisa asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. 43 active cases, Robert said, settling into the chair across from her desk. And we have 6 new applications this week. The hospital social workers are really starting to trust us. They're referring more families who are dealing with overwhelming medical expenses. Lisa opened the folder and looked through the reports. Each page represented a real family, real people facing the same kinds of struggles she and Sophie had experienced. The Hendersons, whose teenage son needed surgery they couldn't afford. The Williams family drowning in debt after the father's heart attack. Mrs. Chen, no relation to Robert, whose cancer treatment had forced her to choose between keeping her small business open and paying for medication. Look at this, Robert said, pulling out a specific report. Remember the Hendersons? Their son Tommy had his surgery last month. The family sent us this. He handed Lisa a handwritten thank you note with a photo attached. The photo showed a smiling teenage boy in a hospital bed, giving a thumbs up to the camera. His parents stood beside him, beaming with relief and gratitude. Tommy wrote the note himself. Robert continued. He says he wants to volunteer with us when he's old enough. He wants to help other kids who are scared about surgery. Lisa felt the familiar warmth that came with these success stories. It never got old, seeing families move from crisis to stability, from fear to hope. That's exactly what Mike would have wanted, she said softly. People who've been through it helping others who are just starting the journey. The door opened and Sophie bounded in, her cheeks flushed from playing outside. At 8 years old now, she'd grown comfortable in this space that had become like a second home to her. After school, she'd do her homework at the small table in the corner of Lisa's office, often chatting with families who came in for meetings. Mommy, there's a lady here with a little girl, Sophie announced. The little girl is crying because she's scared about her daddy being sick. Can I show her my coloring books? Lisa and Robert exchanged a look. Sophie had developed an uncanny ability to connect with children whose families were dealing with medical crises. She seemed to understand instinctively what they were feeling, maybe because she'd been there herself. Of course, sweetheart, Lisa said. But let me talk to the lady first, okay? Lisa walked to the front reception area where she found a woman about her own age, sitting nervously on the edge of a chair. Beside her, a little girl with dark curls was indeed crying quietly, clutching a worn stuffed elephant. Hi, I'm Lisa, she said, approaching gently. I understand you're here because your husband is facing some health challenges. The woman, Janet, she introduced herself, nodded with tears in her eyes. The doctors say he needs heart surgery, but our insurance won't cover all of it. We're looking at maybe $60,000 in bills, and I don't know how we're going to manage. I work part-time at a daycare, and he can't work right now because... It's okay, Lisa said, settling into the chair beside Janet. You don't have to explain everything right now. We're here to help and we understand what you're going through. My husband went through a serious illness too. The little girl, Amy, her mother said, had stopped crying and was watching Lisa curiously. Amy, do you like to color? Lisa asked. The girl nodded shyly. My daughter Sophie loves to color too. She's right around your age and she has some really special coloring books. Would you like to see them while your mom and I talk? Within minutes, Sophie had Amy settled at the children's table with crayons and coloring books, explaining in her matter-of-fact way that sometimes daddies get sick, but there are good doctors who help them feel better. Lisa watched her daughter work her gentle magic and felt proud of the compassionate person she was becoming. The meeting with Janet went well. Mike's Bridge could help with a significant portion of the medical bills, but more importantly, they could connect Janet's family with others who had faced similar situations. Lisa pulled out Mike's notebook, now expanded into a comprehensive database, and found 3 families in the area who had dealt with heart surgery expenses. These families have all been where you are now, Lisa explained. They know which doctors are most understanding about payment plans, which pharmacies offer the best prices for post-surgery medications, even which hotels near the hospital give discounts to medical families. They volunteered to be contacts for new families like yours. After Janet and Amy left, Amy proudly carrying a butterfly drawing that Sophie had made for her, Lisa found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this point. The first few months had been overwhelming. Robert had not only helped them find a safe, affordable place to live, but he'd also offered Lisa a position doing graphic design work for his company. The steady income had been a lifesaver, but more than that, it had given her back her confidence and professional identity. Working with Robert's business clients had reminded Lisa how much she loved design work. She'd started taking on freelance projects in her spare time, rebuilding her portfolio and her client base. Now, 6 months later, she was earning enough from her combined work to support herself and Sophie comfortably. But the real transformation had happened when they'd started working together to bring Mike's dream to life. Using Mike's notebook as a foundation, they'd reached out to families he'd identified and slowly built a network of people who'd survived medical crises and were willing to help others. Robert had provided the business, structure, and financial resources, but Lisa had provided something equally important: the real understanding of what families needed. She knew the questions people were afraid to ask, the small details that could make a huge difference, the emotional support that was sometimes more valuable than money. You know what I realized today? Robert said, returning to the office after walking Janet and Amy to their car. What's that? 6 months ago, when I first knocked on your door, I thought I was just helping one family in crisis. I thought I'd write a check, solve your immediate problem, and that would be it. Lisa smiled. But it turned out to be more complicated than that. No, it turned out to be more meaningful than that. We've helped 43 families, but that's not the real success. The real success is that we've created something that keeps helping people even when we're not directly involved. These families are helping each other now. Through the window, Lisa could see Sophie teaching Amy's mom how to make a paper butterfly, while Amy colored at the outside table. Janet was laughing for the first time since she'd arrived, and Amy was chattering happily about the purple wings on her.